Well, hi there. I'm Dr. Tom Ulrich, and I like to talk about leadership and engineering. Hey, in today's video, we're going to talk about culture, organizational culture, and societal culture. Now, this topic holds kind of a special place in my heart because a little bit about myself, the thing that made me want to get a PhD in organizational leadership after having been an engineer for over, for 30 years, an engineering manager for over 20, is I read a book. Here it is. This is the very book. It was a book. It's a book by Edgar Schein. It's called Organizational Culture and Leadership, and it absolutely blew my mind. For me, being a leader, being a manager was always a little bit like the first several years of marriage, where for me, when I was first married, a lot of things didn't make sense. And what I finally started to do is say, okay, I don't really understand what just happened, but note to self, don't mention this, don't talk about this, guys, key thing to know is if you're newly married, if there's any question like, does this dress make my butt look big, that, there is no right answer. The best thing to do in that case is to fake a medical emergency. But at any rate, my point is, I didn't really understand what was happening, but I started to compile a list of rules like, okay, I don't know what that was about, but don't make that mistake again. And, the truth is leadership and management was like that for me for a long time, where, you keep sort of doing something that seemed like a good idea and this very adverse reaction, and, you can't really make sense of it. Well, what happened when I read this book is Edgar Schein explained to me. I mean, he presents a model, his model of organizational culture and the way he develops the idea. Like, for the first time, I moved from just sort of memorizing, like, okay, yeah, experience would suggest that's a terrible idea, to understanding and then even being able to predict. So that was pretty life-changing. And I mean, the fact that I said, okay, I'm getting a PhD in this, that I don't know if you could express in stronger terms the degree to which this was a game changer. At any rate, so let's talk about culture. So a couple things to know, and I apologize. This video is gonna jump a little bit. We'll kind of be on this, and we'll kind of be on that, and I don't know how else to do it. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the fact that there's two different ways researchers have traditionally approached culture, and so probably prior to 1980, and this is an observation. This is my like, I didn't come up with that idea. This is Hartnell and Walloomba, 2011. That's in the and Ashkenazis and his friends have a handbook of culture and climate. Hartnell and Walloomba wrote one of the chapters, and they talk about this. And they say, there's two traditions. There's the functionalist tradition, and there's the subjectivist tradition. And what the functionalists do is they sort of view culture as observable, objective, and everything about culture is sort of quantifiable. So you go to a country, you observe the way they dress, you observe the food they eat, you observe the expressions they use in their language, you observe their language. That would be the functionalist view. Now, the game really changed with the advent of the subjectivists, where they started to view culture entirely differently. They said, okay, well, culture, fundamentally is not observable. It's subjective, it's very symbolic, and it's very process-oriented. It's kind of all about kind of the scripts and what how things evolve and things of that nature. Okay, so that's the first point I want to make about culture, is that there's two entirely different ways to approach it. Now, the second thing I want to do is I want to develop the history of the subjectivist tradition. And like I mentioned, that really started, books started to appear in this in the 1980s. There's really two very key researchers. So there's Edgar Schein, who of course is my favorite author on anything related to leadership. His insight is unparalleled. And what he did is he looked at organizational culture. And so, instead of just culture, he looked at organizational culture. And the way he did it is he He was actually doing consulting with a number of large corporations, Digital Equipment Corporation, DEC, which, you know, if you're a boomer, you remember back in the day, that was a big company. A big European drug manufacturer, and a lot of other big companies where he kind of got on the inside and studied it that way. By the way, one of the things we know about culture is you really can't study it effectively, or at least one of the big views is you can't study it effectively without becoming an insider or working with an insider. So the older view that, oh, you need to study things in sort of a detached fashion, you just can't make sense of culture in that matter. You have to become an insider. And so that's basically what Schein did. And he really is probably the most significant writer, initial guy who wrote all the, you know, the definitive works. Now, about the same time, Gert Hofstede in the Netherlands, he was looking at societal culture. So right there, let's pause. We have organizational culture and societal culture. They are related. They are not identical. Schein kind of deals with the difference by referring to societal culture as macro culture, culture at sort of a higher level. At any rate, Hofstede, he actually makes a curious comment that he sort of fell into this study by accident, where basically he was doing a study of employees at IBM, and that's important to note. Sometimes people say he studied managers at IBM. Well, in his book, he's real careful to point out that stop saying that. It's employees. It wasn't just managers. But he was looking at employees at IBM, and of course, IBM, you know, was even at the time had multiple divisions all across the world. And at any rate, so those are kind of the two key guys, our key researchers. All right, so let's now jump specifically to organizational culture, and let's you know, how we're still on the history of it, but how did we get the definition of organizational culture? And what happened in 1983? Edgar Schein wrote a white paper at MIT. And a very significant white paper. I think most white papers don't have such profound effect, but you can actually, you know, like you can go to Amazon and buy this white paper. It's all bound in its own little book. But at any rate, he proposed some new ways of thinking about it. In 1985, he published the first edition of the textbook I showed you a second ago, and Organizational Culture and Leadership. And he provided he kind of expanded and developed his idea from the white paper. In 1999, he published his Corporate Culture Survival Guide. The idea there is that, you know, the textbook, the Organizational Culture and Leadership, it's pretty spectacular, but it is a textbook, and it takes a commitment to read. Whereas the Corporate Culture Survival Guide is written a little bit for people who have maybe don't want to put the commitment in. At any rate, that's kind of how the idea of organizational culture evolved. It really was Schein providing these important definitions. Meanwhile, what happened is Hofstede and Triandis and Gelfand, and then Robert House, the Globe study, what they did is they started to look at the components of culture. Now, they were more looking at societal culture rather than organizational culture, but they were looking at it from the perspective of organizations. So they were sort of asking, how does societal culture affect organizations? And so you see that, you know, the societal culture and organizational culture, I mean, they are different, but they're not all that unrelated. At any rate, Hofstede, what he did is he initially had 5 dimensions of culture that he identified. So, for instance, he had power distance and future orientation and things of that nature. And then in some of the subsequent versions of the book, a 6th one showed up. Triandis and Gelfand, they didn't have a book. They had just a very important little paper. Well, not little, it was huge actually. I mean, well, it wasn't all that many words, but it was significant is what I'm trying to say. Sorry, engineer, I just can't help those kind of little... Anyway, so Triandis and Gelfand, they looked at, Hofstede had this idea, one of his dimensions was individualism versus collectivism. So the idea is, you know, do you tend to value the individual or the group? And, you know, they, in Hofstede's saying, he identified that. Well, Triandis and Gelfand, they observed, you know, said, why is it that collectivism in Northern Europe looks so different from collectivism in Japan. And so they were kind of trying to get to the bottom of that. And what they came up with is Hofstede sort of viewed individualism and collectivism as a continuum. And what Chandis and Gelfand said is actually those are two orthogonal things where you can be high and low. And then just to make things more fun, they also conceptualize each as having a horizontal and a vertical component. So if your horizontal component would be sort of compared to your peers, and vertical maybe compared to your parents or supervisors and so on. So they tried to ferret that out. The reason I mention them, and I think a lot of summaries of this sort of thing don't mention them, but the reason I think it's significant is the biggest study ever done on societal culture it was done by Robert House, and it was called the Globe Study, Project Globe, Global Leadership and Organizational Behavior Effectiveness. And Chandis was kind of the godfather of that thing. A whole bunch of the people in it he had influenced. They had been his graduate students. Michelle Gelfand, as in the Chandis and Gelfand paper, she wrote one of the chapters. Anyway, it was this massive effort, and they identified 9 dimensions of culture. And they studied 62 societies. They had 162 researchers from all over the world. I mean, they had 17,000 results to their surveys. It's just this massive effort. But the point there is that Chandis actually wrote the introduction in the final, in the final report. It's this big old honking thing. Chandis sort of wrote the introduction, and he's kind of when we talk about the history of this, if you leave Harry Chandis out, you've missed something. At any rate, so we'll get more into Globe in other videos, but the point is people have figured out that culture has dimensions, and then what they did in Globe study is for the 62 societies, they sort of mapped them in various ways, and so you could sort of predict how things will behave and quantify it and sort of really get to some understanding. All right, so now what I'm going to do, having explained some of the history, now I'm going to give you a couple definitions. So Peter Northouse, of course, his I think it was the second leadership book I ever read, and it was equally amazing. But he has just a great definition called organizational culture. Great, especially from the perspective of your head is spinning, all this stuff. Just boil it down. What is it? And here's what Northouse says: culture is how we do things around here. Oh, okay, I can get my head around that. Now, Hofstede, he talked about societal culture, and again, they're related. But this is what he says. This is on page 6 of his 3rd edition. He says, culture consists of the unwritten rules of the social game. It is the collective programming of the mind that distinguishes the member of one group or category of people from others. Collective programming of the mind. By the way, in his book, he the title's Culture and Organizations, and the subtitle's Software of the Mind. So he's got this idea that culture is sort of the computer program that's running in our brain. All right, so next then, and kind of building to this as a crescendo, is Schein's definition of culture. And in order to get that, I have to stop and I have to talk about Schein's model of culture, because his definition sort of relies on the model, and so I have to do the model first. So I apologize for bouncing around, but now we're going to do Schein's model. All right, so Schein's model was that organizational culture exists in 3 layers. So and it's like an iceberg, so you only see the tip, and there's all this stuff under the waterline. So there's artifacts. So what Schein says is these are the, quote, visible and feelable structures and processes, and he describes it as these are the observable behaviors, and he makes an interesting note. He says, these are really difficult to decipher. And for instance, a thing, maybe in the workplace, at Tandem, it's just pure chaos artifacts, the Nerf guns, the marshmallow guns, there's just all these toys, all these things. We have a very unique culture, a very fun culture, a freakishly high retention rate, employee retention rate. And the thing about that is, a mistake a classic culture kind of mistake would be if somebody came in and observed our culture and said, oh, well, they have Nerf guns, and say, well, they want to bring that culture to their company, so they go buy Nerf guns and hand them out. And it would just be met with confusion. See, because the issue is, although that's what you see, it's the stuff under the waterline that makes sense of those artifacts. And that's why the artifacts are difficult to decipher. You have to get to what's below the waterline to make any sense of this. So the next layer down is what Schein calls, quote, espoused beliefs and values. And so this is what, if you ask somebody, well, what's important to your group, this is what they would say. So it includes ideologies, it includes rationalizations, Schein has this list: ideals, goals, values, aspirations. I mean, it's all the things that people in the group would report. So it's their espoused beliefs and values. Below that, and even more significant, is what Schein calls the basic underlying assumptions. So maybe you could just reword that. Instead of saying espoused beliefs and values, you could say actual beliefs and values. But Schein says basic underlying assumptions. And what those are is those are things you actually believe. Schein says this. He says those are unconscious, taken for granted beliefs and values. And these are the things that determine the behavior, the perception. Ooh, did you catch that? Perception, how you even perceive things, thoughts, and feelings. And with regard to that model, Schein makes a bunch of really mind-blowing observations. And what he first, he has a whole book on it, but some of the things that really resonated with me was, he says, with any group, typically your espoused beliefs and values do not align with your basic underlying assumptions. So, any group says one thing and what they actually do isn't always aligned. And let me give you a very clear example. This is an example from Schein himself, but he says, in the United States, just company after company touts the importance of teamwork, and yet they continue to do raises and bonuses based on individual performance. And so the espoused thing is we value teams, but the real thing is we value individuals. Now here's the thing that Schein says that is just mind-blowing. He says, one way to think about leadership is the basic task of leadership is to bring together your espoused beliefs with your basic underlying assumptions. So in Schein's view, leadership is all about getting those things to align. And then he says, and here's another just classic Schein insight, he says, for him, leadership and culture are two sides of the same coin. There's so many implications from that. I mean, one of which is, if you're in the leadership business, you're in the culture business. And another famous Schein thing is, he says, as a leader in a modern organization, you have two choices. You can either get on top of this culture thing, or this culture thing is going to just prevent you from succeeding. At any rate, so now that I've laid all that out, let me give it to you. Here is Edgar Schein's definition of culture. He articulated this in his white paper in the early 80s. It's stood the test of time. The fifth edition of his book now, he co-authors with his son Peter. But this definition absolutely stays intact. And that, by the way, is amazing for something to endure that much time and stand firm and be the results. It's still the seminal work, and so much in the academic study of organizational culture. It's Schein is the man. Anyway, so here's what Schein says, quoting here. This is on page 18 from, I think it was the 5th edition. But he says, look, organizational or culture is a pattern of shared basic assumptions. So it's these basic assumptions. So that's the lowest level of the iceberg. So culture is the pattern of the basic assumptions learned by a group. So these assumptions are learned by a group. And how do they learn it? They learn it as they solve their unique problems of external adaptation and internal integration. So what does that mean? It means it's these basic assumptions were created as they tried to figure out how to get along in their environment, in their work, maybe in their competitive industry, or whatever. And also they just tried to figure out how to work with one another, like how are we going to kind of as a group do this thing, and which worked well enough. So they came up with this pattern of assumptions that they learned as they tried to figure out how to exist in an environment and work together. and it's the patterns that worked well enough to be considered valid. Like, oh no, this is true. This, so you kind of go from this coming up with something that works well, and okay, this is true. So it's considered valid and worthy to be taught to new members. It's worked well enough to be taught to new members. So there's this process, often you don't even realize it's happening, but people come in the group and you're teaching these things. What are you teaching them? That these values as the correct way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to those problems of external adaptation and internal integration. Anyway, I know that's a lot, and I'm going to kind of end it here. But that's Shine's definition of culture, and the whole key is it gets to those things we may not even be aware of, but we truly believe. At any rate, hey, for more videos, please visit my website, tomulrichconsulting.com. There's a pull down there. You can also go to YouTube. I think if you search on Dr. Tom Ulrich, you'll find my stuff. And as always, thank you for listening. We'll talk to you next time.